At 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, I was staring at my laptop screen with the resignation letter already typed up, finger hovering over the send button, watching Madison Parker tell our biggest defense contractor that I was transitioning to an advisory role while I sat 3 floors above them, still officially running the damn account. The name's Thomas Anderson, but everyone calls me Tom. I'm 52, been doing this for 25 years, and I'd just watched a 29-year-old MBA tell a room full of executives that my workflow was legacy bloat that needed aggressive optimization. You know that moment when you realize you're done? Not angry done or frustrated done, but just done. Like when you're fixing the same broken thing for the 10th time and you finally accept that nobody actually wants it fixed, they just want to complain about it. That was me, Tuesday morning, coffee getting cold, listening to Maddie explain to Pinnacle Defense Systems Board why their $16 million contract would run smoother without the guy who'd been managing it for 8 years. Let me back up and give you the whole picture. I spent 12 years in the Air Force, mostly working logistics and procurement for fighter squadrons. You learn real fast in the military that when someone's life depends on your work, there's no room for shortcuts or creative interpretations. A bolt either meets spec or it doesn't. Documentation is either complete or it's not. There's no middle ground when you're dealing with aircraft that cost more than most people's houses. After I got out in '99, I figured the defense contractor world would be a natural fit. Same attention to detail, same regulatory environment, but with better pay and nobody shooting at you. I was right about 2 of those things. I started at Meridian Tech Solutions as a junior project coordinator, handling smaller government contracts. Back then, the company was maybe 200 people and everyone knew everyone. The founder, Richard Kozlov, was an ex-Navy guy who understood that defense work was about reliability, not flash. Boring and profitable, he used to say. That's how we stay in business. Within 3 years, I was managing my first major contract. 5 years after that, I was running the entire defense division. The military experience mattered. I spoke the same language as our clients, understood their priorities, knew how to navigate the bureaucracy without cutting corners on compliance. When Pinnacle Defense Systems put out their RFP in 2015, I personally led the proposal effort. Spent 6 months learning their operation, understanding their pain points, crafting a solution that would actually work instead of just sounding impressive. We won the contract not because we had the lowest bid, but because they trusted us to deliver, and we did. For 8 years, we never missed a deadline, never failed an audit, never had a security incident. Pinnacle manufactured critical components for F-35 fighters, and our job was managing their supply chain data, ensuring compliance with international traffic and arms regulations, and maintaining the paper trail that kept everyone out of federal prison. It wasn't glamorous work. Lots of spreadsheets, lots of documentation, lots of phone calls with quality control managers who'd spent their careers making sure aircraft parts met military specifications. But it was solid, steady, and it paid well. That $16 million annual contract represented about 40% of our company's revenue. More importantly, it represented trust. Colonel James Bradley, Pinnacle's head of operations, was a guy who'd flown F-16s in Iraq before transitioning to the business side. He understood that in defense work, relationships matter more than technology. When something went wrong, and something always goes wrong, he knew he could call me directly and get a straight answer. That relationship took years to build. Defense contractors don't switch vendors lightly. Too much risk, too much paperwork, too many ways for new providers to screw up compliance and create legal headaches. Once they trust you, they tend to stick with you as long as you keep delivering. Which brings me back to Madison Parker and her digital transformation initiative. She arrived in January with credentials that looked impressive on paper. Stanford MBA, 5 years at consulting firms, experience with emerging technologies in regulated industries. Her dad, Richard Kozlov, had brought her in as VP of Digital Innovation with a mandate to modernize our operational framework. I met her during her first week when she scheduled individual meetings with all department heads. She walked into my office wearing a perfectly tailored business suit, carrying an iPad, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything important. "Tom," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I've been reviewing our client portfolio, and I'm really excited about the potential I see here, especially with Pinnacle. There are so many opportunities to optimize their experience through digital transformation." I asked what specific optimization she had in mind. She launched into a presentation about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automated compliance workflows. She talked about reducing manual processes, streamlining data analysis, and leveraging cutting-edge solutions to deliver exponential value. It sounded impressive. It also showed she'd never actually read our contract with Pinnacle, because about half of what she was proposing would violate ITAR regulations, and the other half would require client approval that would take months to obtain. I explained this politely, mentioning the regulatory constraints and the client's conservative approach to operational changes. She nodded and took notes, but I could see in her eyes that she'd already categorized me as someone who doesn't get it. Over the next 2 months, Madison started implementing changes across the company. New project management software that looked sleek but couldn't handle classified data properly, revised reporting structures that broke our established audit trails, streamlined communication protocols that bypassed the documentation requirements our clients expected. Each time I raised concerns, she'd smile and explain how we'd address those legacy constraints during the transition phase. When I asked for specifics, she'd talk about agile adaptation and iterative problem solving. That should have been my second warning. The first was when she called my workflow legacy bloat. The real problem started in March when Madison decided to pilot her new systems with the Pinnacle account. Without consulting me first, she implemented a new data management platform that looked modern but had zero integration with our existing compliance tracking systems. I found out about it on a Monday morning when my team couldn't access the quarterly audit files. The new system had imported everything, but it had stripped out the metadata that showed who had reviewed each document and when. In defense work, that audit trail isn't just important, it's legally required. I called Madison immediately. She was in a meeting but took my call, sounding slightly annoyed that I was focusing on technical details instead of the bigger picture. "Tom, this is exactly the kind of legacy thinking we need to move past," she said. "The new platform has built-in version control. It's much more sophisticated than what we were using." I explained that sophistication wasn't the issue. ITR regulations required specific documentation protocols, and her new system couldn't generate the compliance reports that Pinnacle's auditors expected. "We'll customize it," she said. "That's what agile development is for." The customization took 3 weeks. During that time, we had to manually recreate our audit trails using spreadsheets, which meant my team was working overtime to meet our reporting deadlines. When Pinnacle's quality assurance manager called to ask why their monthly compliance report was late, I had to explain that we were upgrading our systems. Colonel Bradley wasn't happy. "Tom, we've never had delays before. What's going on over there?" I gave him the diplomatic version. System improvements, temporary transition issues, everything back to normal soon. But I could hear the concern in his voice. Defense contractors hate surprises, and late reports definitely qualify as surprises. Madison's next brilliant idea was reorganizing my team structure. In April, she announced that we were implementing a matrix management approach that would break down silos and encourage cross-functional collaboration. Translation: she was taking my experienced defense specialists and rotating them through other departments so they could broaden their skill sets. Meanwhile, she was bringing in people from her previous consulting jobs to inject fresh perspectives into our operations. The fresh perspectives didn't understand ITAR compliance. They didn't know the difference between controlled technical data and general business information. During one particularly memorable incident, one of Madison's new hires nearly sent classified specifications to an overseas vendor because the email looked like a routine procurement request. I caught it before anything went out, but it took 2 days of paperwork and explanations to document the near miss for our security officer. When I mentioned this to Madison, she shrugged it off as a learning opportunity and suggested that our classification procedures were probably too rigid anyway. That's when I started keeping detailed records of every conversation, every email, every decision that seemed questionable. 25 years of military and corporate experience had taught me that when things start going sideways, documentation becomes your best friend. By May, Pinnacle was asking direct questions about our staffing changes. They'd noticed that their regular contacts were being rotated out, and new people were handling tasks that had previously been managed by experienced specialists. "Tom," Colonel Bradley said during one of our monthly reviews, "I don't want to micromanage your operations, but we're seeing some inconsistencies in your deliverables. Nothing major, but enough to notice." I assured him we were working through some transition issues and that quality would return to our normal standards. Internally, I was escalating concerns to Gerald Torres, our general counsel, about the compliance risks Madison's changes were creating. Gerald was worried too. He'd been reviewing the contract modifications Madison was proposing, and several of them would require formal amendments that Pinnacle would need to approve. Tom, some of these changes could trigger review clauses in the contract. Has Madison discussed this with the client? She hadn't. When I brought it up in our weekly staff meeting, Madison said she was managing the client relationship strategically, and that involving them in internal operational details would be counterproductive. I pointed out that moving data processing offshore wasn't an internal operational detail, it was a fundamental change to our service delivery model that violated our current security requirements. Madison's response was to schedule a private meeting with our CEO, Richard Kozlov, to discuss resistance to innovation within the Defense Division. I wasn't invited to that meeting, but Gerald filled me in afterward. She told your father that you're blocking necessary modernization efforts, Gerald said. She presented a whole analysis about how your traditional approaches are limiting the company's growth potential. Richard, to his credit, had asked about client satisfaction and contract compliance. Madison assured him that Pinnacle would adapt to the improvements once they saw the benefits. That's when Gerald mentioned Clause 7.2a, the key personnel continuity requirement buried on page 12 of our contract. It specified that certain named individuals had to remain actively involved in the project, and if any of them left or were reassigned, Pinnacle had the right to terminate the contract with 30 days' notice. I was the only person named in that clause. Did Madison know about this? Richard asked. Gerald showed him the email thread where I'd specifically highlighted this requirement 3 months earlier. Madison had responded that contract constraints could be negotiated around during the modernization process. Richard went quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked Gerald to set up a meeting with Pinnacle's legal team to discuss potential contract modifications. That meeting never happened. Before Gerald could schedule it, Madison made her next move, announcing that she was restructuring client communications to present a more unified organizational voice. Starting in June, all major client interactions would go through her office. I would transition to a strategic oversight role, focusing on high-level relationship management, while her team handled day-to-day operations. She sent this announcement to the entire company, copying Pinnacle's leadership team, without discussing it with me first. Colonel Bradley's response was immediate and direct. He called me within an hour of receiving Madison's announcement, and his tone was different from our usual conversations. Formal, careful, the voice of someone who was documenting everything for potential legal purposes. Tom, I need clarification on this organizational restructuring. Are you still the primary point of contact for our contract? I explained Madison's new communication structure as diplomatically as possible, emphasizing that I remained involved in strategic oversight, but Bradley cut through the corporate speak. Strategic oversight isn't what our contract specifies. We have a named personnel requirement that explicitly identifies you as the operational lead. Has this changed? That's when I realized how serious this had become. Bradley wasn't just asking as a concerned client, he was asking as a former military officer who understood contracts and compliance requirements. He knew exactly what Clause 7.2a said, and he was giving us a chance to fix this before it became a legal issue. I told him I'd get clarification from our leadership team and get back to him within 24 hours. I went straight to Gerald's office. He was already on the phone with our insurance carrier, discussing potential liability issues related to Madison's operational changes. When he hung up, his expression was grim. Tom, we've got bigger problems than client communications. I've been reviewing the compliance documentation for the past 4 months, and there are gaps everywhere. Madison's new systems aren't generating the audit trails we need. Her staff rotations have created knowledge gaps in critical areas, and some of the process changes she's implemented could put us in violation of federal regulations. He showed me a thick folder of documentation, emails, system reports, compliance checklists that hadn't been properly completed. If Pinnacle decides to audit us, or if there's any kind of federal investigation, we're exposed. I asked what he recommended. Honestly, either Madison needs to understand the regulatory environment she's operating in, or she needs to step back and let you manage this contract the way it's supposed to be managed. That afternoon, I requested a private meeting with Richard Kozloff. I'd known him for 17 years, worked directly for him for the past 8, and I'd never had to have this kind of conversation with him before. Richard listened while I explained the compliance risks, the client concerns, and the potential contract violations. I showed him Gerald's documentation, Bradley's formal inquiries, and the specific ITAR requirements that Madison's changes were impacting. Tom, I appreciate your concerns, but Madison has a mandate to modernize our operations. Defense work can't stay stuck in the past forever. I agreed that modernization was important, but pointed out that it had to be done within regulatory constraints and with client approval. Richard, we're risking a $16 million contract that represents 40% of our revenue. Is that really worth the risk? He was quiet for a long time, looking through Gerald's compliance documentation. Finally, he said, "Let me talk to Madison. Maybe there's a middle ground here." That middle ground turned out to be Madison's decision to accelerate her timeline. Instead of gradually transitioning responsibilities, she announced that the new operational structure would go live immediately. The quarterly business review with Pinnacle was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Madison decided this would be the perfect opportunity to showcase our modernized capabilities and introduce the client to our next-generation service delivery model. She scheduled the meeting without consulting me, using the conference room on the second floor instead of our usual setup. When I asked about the agenda, she said she was handling the presentation and that my role would be strategic input as needed. I spent Monday evening preparing for every possible scenario. I reviewed our contract line by line, printed copies of all the compliance documentation, and prepared responses to the questions I knew Bradley would ask. Tuesday morning at 5:47 a.m., I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, watching the pre-meeting setup on our company's video system. Madison was already in the conference room, testing her presentation equipment and reviewing her slides. Her presentation was impressive: sleek graphics, industry buzzwords, impressive-sounding metrics about efficiency improvements and cost optimization. It was also completely disconnected from the reality of defense contract work. She talked about AI-driven quality assurance, without mentioning that our AI systems couldn't handle classified data. She discussed streamlined offshore processing without acknowledging ITR restrictions. She presented automated compliance monitoring that didn't actually exist in any functional form. When Bradley asked specific questions about regulatory compliance, Madison deflected with general statements about best practices and industry standards. When Pinnacle's quality manager asked about the recent delays in their monthly reports, Madison blamed legacy system limitations that were being addressed through digital transformation. That's when Bradley asked the question I'd been waiting for. Where's Tom Anderson in all this? He's been our primary contact for 8 years, and his team has never missed a deadline or failed an audit. Madison's response was smooth and practiced. Tom's transitioning to an advisory role as we modernize our operations. Our new team brings fresh perspectives and cutting-edge methodologies that will significantly enhance your experience. I watched Bradley's expression change. He leaned forward, and his voice took on that formal tone I'd heard the day before. Advisory role? Tom specifically named in our contract as the operational lead. This sounds like a significant change to our service delivery model. Madison didn't miss a beat. Tom's expertise is being leveraged at a strategic level, while our operational team implements next-generation solutions. This transition will deliver exponential value through optimized processes and enhanced capabilities. That's when I opened my resignation letter, updated the timestamp, and hit send to the entire executive team. Then I joined the video call, turned on my camera, and held up the printed letter so everyone could see it clearly. The silence was immediate and absolute. 23 faces stared at me through their screens while I spoke directly to the camera. I want to make sure everyone understands what just happened. Effective immediately, I'm no longer employed by this company. Madison, the next generation solutions are all yours now. Bradley leaned back in his chair, and I could see him processing what had just happened. He looked directly at the camera and asked, "Tom, are you serious about this?" "Completely serious, Colonel. Good luck with the exponential value and optimized processes." Then I closed my laptop and went to make myself a sandwich. The next few hours were instructive. My phone started ringing within 15 minutes. First Gerald, then Richard, then Madison herself. I didn't answer any of them. I was busy updating my LinkedIn profile and reviewing the non-compete clauses in my employment contract. By noon, I had 8 voicemails, 23 text messages, and 47 emails. The general theme was variations of, "Call me immediately," and "We need to discuss this situation." The most interesting message came from Gerald at 11:30 a.m. "Tom, Pinnacle's legal team just called. They're invoking Clause 7.2a. We need to talk." I didn't call him back. I already knew what Clause 7.2a said, and I knew exactly what Pinnacle's legal team was doing. What I didn't know was how fast corporate panic could spread through a modern office building. According to the messages I was getting from former colleagues, the reaction was immediate and comprehensive. Madison had tried to continue the presentation after I logged off, but her confidence was evaporating in real time. The board members on the call stopped asking questions and started taking notes. One of the investors killed his video feed entirely. When Bradley asked who would be taking over my responsibilities, Madison mentioned her offshore pipeline and cross-trained specialists. Bradley's response was polite but final. "We'll be in touch through our legal team." The formal termination notice arrived at 2:47 p.m., exactly 9 hours after my resignation. Pinnacle's message was brief and legally precise. Due to departure of key personnel as specified in Clause 7.2a, Pinnacle Defense Systems hereby terminates contract number PDS 2015-447, effective 30 days from this notice. All work product and materials remain subject to existing confidentiality and security requirements. No negotiation, no discussion about alternatives, no opportunity for Madison to explain her next-generation solutions. Just a clean, professional termination of a $16 million annual contract. The industry reaction was swift and predictable. Defense contracting is a small world, and news travels fast when major contracts get terminated. By Thursday, I was getting calls from competitors who'd been trying to win Pinnacle's business for years. By Friday, industry publications were running articles about compliance failures in digital transformation initiatives. Madison tried damage control, sending company-wide emails about temporary setbacks and strategic repositioning opportunities. She scheduled all-hands meetings to explain how losing their biggest client was actually part of a larger vision for company growth. The meetings were poorly attended. Richard Kozlov's response was more direct. 3 weeks later, Madison's employment was terminated by mutual agreement. Her LinkedIn profile still listed her as driving digital transformation in regulated industries, but her access badge stopped working on a Tuesday morning, and her parking space was reassigned by lunch. The ripple effects continued for months. 2 other defense contractors requested immediate meetings to review their contracts and discuss continuity assurances. When they learned that the person who'd managed Pinnacle's account was no longer with the company, both contracts were terminated within 60 days. Our company's annual revenue dropped from $40 million to $24 million. The planned merger with a larger defense contractor was postponed indefinitely. The buyer wanted stable client relationships, not viral resignation videos and contract terminations. Employee departures accelerated as people started questioning leadership decisions. Gerald Torres left 4 months later for a general counsel position with one of our former competitors. In his farewell email, he mentioned that recent events had reinforced his belief that compliance and client relationships should never be subordinated to operational experimentation. As for me, I had 3 job offers within 2 weeks of my resignation. Defense contractors value experience, reliability, and proven track records. They're less interested in digital transformation than they are in getting their products delivered on time and within specification. I accepted a position with Sterling Defense Solutions, one of Pinnacle's suppliers. My first assignment was helping them prepare a bid for the contract my former company had just lost. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. 6 months later, Pinnacle awarded their new service contract to Sterling Defense Solutions. The contract value was $18 million annually, $2 million more than what they'd been paying my former company. When Colonel Bradley called to congratulate me on winning the bid, he mentioned that they'd learned some valuable lessons about the importance of stable relationships in their vendor selection process. Madison's LinkedIn profile disappeared sometime in the fall. Word through industry contacts was that she'd moved to a startup focused on disrupting traditional supply chain management. The startup folded 8 months later. Richard Kozlov called me in December, almost a year after my resignation. The company was struggling without their major defense contracts, and several potential clients had specifically asked if I'd be involved in any new projects. He wanted to know if I'd consider returning as a consultant. I listened politely, thanked him for thinking of me, and declined. Sterling Defense Solutions appreciated my expertise, valued my experience, and understood that defense work requires patience, attention to detail, and respect for regulatory requirements. The resignation letter is still in my desk drawer, printed and signed. Sometimes when I'm dealing with someone who thinks experience is just another word for outdated, I remember that Tuesday morning when I held up a piece of paper and reminded everyone what actually matters in this business. You don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes you just need to stop talking and let the consequences do the work for you.